Welcome to Miss Marple Mystery. Tonight's chilling tale begins in the snow-covered village of Mary Mead, where a Christmas pudding hides a deadly secret. Can you guess who placed the knife inside before Miss Marple does? Where are you listening from? Let us know in the comments below. It was the sort of December morning that made Mary Mead look like a Christmas card, soft white snow clinging to the rooftops, a wisp of smoke rising from every chimney, and the faint sound of the church bells marking 10:30. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever fond of her morning gossip, declared that it was too picturesque for its own good. Something dreadful always happens when things look that lovely. And, as it turned out, she was not wrong. Preparations were well underway at the vicarage for the annual Christmas luncheon. The tables were laid with polished silver, holly wreaths hung at every doorway, and Mrs. Price, the housemaid, moved briskly between the kitchen and the dining room, humming softly as she worked. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Weatherby, a kindly but easily flustered woman, had been up since dawn, making sure the pudding was steamed to perfection. It was her pride, the traditional plum pudding soaked in brandy, studded with almonds and raisins, and hidden within it, as custom dictated, were small silver charms, a thimble, a ring, and a tiny coin, each meant to predict the coming year's fortune. By noon, a small party of guests had gathered Miss Marple among them, sitting quietly by the fire, knitting something delicate and grey. She had been invited as an old friend of Mrs. Weatherby's, though everyone in the village knew that where Miss Marple went, curiosity followed close behind. Also present were Colonel Halberd, retired and irritable, his wife Clarissa, whose laughter could be heard before she entered a room, the young curate, Mr. Greaves, who blushed at every word, and Dr. Lyon, who had a way of talking to everyone as if they were slightly feverish. The luncheon began pleasantly enough. There was laughter, a mild argument about whether the snow would last till Boxing Day, and a teasing remark from Colonel Halberd about how Mrs. Price could run the house better than most generals ran their men. It was only when dessert was brought in, the grand plum pudding, steaming and fragrant, that the day began to tilt toward tragedy. Mrs. Price, her hands carefully gloved in linen, carried the pudding in upon a silver tray. "Mind your step, Price," said Mrs. Weatherby anxiously, "and do be careful of the holly sprig, it wobbles dreadfully." But Mrs. Price only smiled, her lips pressed thin, her eyes oddly downcast. She placed the pudding on the table, curtsied slightly, and retreated to the kitchen. Moments later, Mrs. Weatherby plunged the knife into the pudding and gasped. "Good heavens!" she cried, her face paling. The knife had struck something hard, something that made a sharp clink. A murmur rose around the table. "One of the charms, perhaps," said Dr. Lyon lightly. "You've hit the coin." But Mrs. Weatherby shook her head. The knife had met not silver, but steel. When she lifted the blade again, it came up slick and dark. For one awful moment, no one spoke. Then Miss Marple, still seated by the fire, said in her calm, tremulous voice, "My dear Mrs. Weatherby, I think it would be wise not to touch anything further." Colonel Halberd rose, peered at the pudding, and swore under his breath. A kitchen knife, long, thin, and gleaming faintly, was lodged inside, half buried in the rich fruit and suet. It was not the carving knife from the table. It belonged, unmistakably, to the kitchen. By the time Inspector Craddock from Much Benham arrived, a broad man with an equally broad sense of disbelief, the pudding sat in solemn silence, covered with a tea towel. Mrs. Price, the housemaid, was nowhere to be found. "She's gone," said Mrs. Weatherby, faintly, wringing her hands. "Just vanished. Her apron's still in the scullery, and she didn't even take her coat. She's never done such a thing in all her life." Craddock frowned. "When was she last seen?" "Just before we began dessert," said the curate nervously. "She brought in the pudding and went back toward the kitchen. And no one saw her after that." No one had. Miss Marple's eyes, pale and bright, rested on the tray where the pudding had been carried in. "There are 2 sets of footprints in the snow by the kitchen door," she said mildly. "One leaving, one entering. The entering set is larger boots, I should think. The other rather smaller, and pointed, likely her own. But the smaller set stops halfway to the gate." Craddock turned sharply. "You noticed that?" "Quite by chance," said Miss Marple, threading her needle again. "Though one can't help but wonder why a housemaid would leave her place of work in the middle of a Norse Christmas luncheon without her coat on a day as cold as this." The inspector gave her a long, assessing look. "You've an eye for detail, Miss Marple." "Oh no," she said gently. "Only for people. It's remarkable what one can observe about them when one simply listens." There was a long silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. The smell of the pudding still lingered, sweet and heavy. The guests shifted uneasily in their chairs. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft, slow flakes covering the path where 2 sets of footprints now lay half-buried. Miss Marple, looking out the frosted window, murmured almost to herself, "A knife in a pudding, a vanished maid, and footprints that end before the gate. How very deliberate." And somewhere in the village, far from the warmth of the vicarage fire, a woman in a white kitchen uniform walked swiftly through the snow, leaving behind her the faintest trace of plum on her sleeve and something dark beneath it. The snow thickened as Inspector Craddock asked the guests to remain while constables searched the vicarage grounds. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as a cushion, inquired whether the holly sprig had been cut from the little bush beside the steps. On hearing that it had, she nodded and grew thoughtful. Within the hour, the luncheon dissolved into anxious knots of talk. Mrs. Dolly Bantry arrived first, brisk and sympathetic, bringing 2 scones. "A knife in a pudding," she breathed, eyes shining with dreadful delight. "People expect sixpences, not cutlery." Colonel Halberd paced like a caged bear, declaring the maid had bolted with a tradesman. Clarissa Halberd contradicted him. "Housemaids," she said, "only eloped with sergeants." The curate whispered a prayer and scattered the sugar tongs. Craddock returned from the yard with a narrow ribbon, brown-stained and frayed at one end. "Found by the kitchen door," he said. "Looks like apron trimming. Mrs. Weatherby, suede." And Miss Marple guided her to a chair with a calm, ordinary touch. "My dear," she murmured, "ribbons seldom frays without worry. Either fingers have troubled it recently or time has." The vicar's wife dabbed her eyes. When calm permitted, Miss Marple asked for warm water and washed the holly sprig. A faint smear dissolved, sticky rather than red. "Brandy and treacle," she observed, "and something resinous. Garden varnish, perhaps, used to gloss the leaves." Mrs. Weatherby confessed she had polished the holly with the same mixture used on the choir candlesticks. "So silly of me." "Not at all," Miss Marple said. "It helps us sort Christmas from mischief." The bell rang, and in came Mrs. Hartnell with her sister Miss Murgatroyd, condolences wrapped round intelligence. They brought High Street news. Mrs. Price had been seen yesterday in earnest talk with Mr. Pritchard, the butcher. A telegram had arrived at the Green Man addressed to a lady. And schoolboys, degenerate as ever, had pelted the railway notice board with snow. Miss Marple listened, head slightly bent. Craddock took statements. Timings were drearily precise. Only one item resisted tidiness. After setting down the pudding, Mrs. Price went to fetch custard from the cool pantry and did not return. The pantry opened onto the back passage. Beyond lay scullery, porch, and yard. 2 sets of prints, as Miss Marple had noted, one larger coming in, one smaller going out and stopping short of the gate. "Carried," Miss Marple said softly, when the facts were repeated. "Or lifted into something." She glanced at the Colonel's motorcar in the lane, its rear rug shaken earlier by Clarissa. Porches collect adaptable objects, sacks, hampers, boot scrapers. The Colonel bristled. "No one has been near my car." "Quite so," Miss Marple replied. At dusk, a constable reported that a lady's bicycle with a wicker basket was missing from the vicarage shed. "Missus, prices," said Mrs. Weatherby. "But the shed shows no fresh tracks." Craddock frowned. "Then it was wheeled through the house, or taken earlier." Miss Marple's eyes brightened at the thought of wicker. "Baskets hide much and announce a little," she murmured. "They creak when overladen." In the kitchen, she examined the pudding basin cupboard. One bowl sat out of sequence, a new enamel among old brown stoneware. Its underside held a smear of candle grease. "New things in old places are like strangers at whist," she said. "Everyone notices, and nobody remarks it." She tapped the enamel rim. It rang too sharply. From the scullery window, she studied the half-buried prints. A faint drag crossed the smaller steps, as though a hem had trailed. She remembered Mrs. Price's uniform. White, starched, a shade too long. Beyond the gate, the larger boots turned toward the lane and vanished beneath drifted snow. Deliberate, Miss Marple thought, yet hurried at the edges. Craddock asked if she meant accomplices. "Oh, dear me. Accomplices belong to melodrama," she said. "What we have is convenience. Someone relied on the village to explain itself, which it does with admirable energy." She folded her knitting and added, "If you please, Inspector, might we ask Mr. Pritchard for his account before evening makes him stoutly forgetful? And perhaps, while we walk, we shall learn whether custard or courage truly left the pantry first that day." The short walk to Mr. Pritchard's butcher shop was muffled by snow and speculation. Inspector Craddock trudged ahead, his boots crunching on the icy lane, while Miss Marple followed a few steps behind, her small figure wrapped in grey wool. The sky was the color of pewter. Faint candlelight glimmered behind the curtained windows of the cottages they passed. The village, though outwardly peaceful, hummed beneath its skin. Everyone knew by now that a knife had been found in the pudding, and that Mrs. Price, the housemaid, had vanished without her coat. In Mary Mead, such tidings travelled faster than influenza. When they reached Pritchard's shop, the bell above the door jangled sharply. The butcher, a thick man with a florid face and apron, still spattered with the day's work, looked up from his ledger. "Evening, Inspector," he said uneasily, wiping his hands on a cloth. "And, Miss Marple, bit late for chops, isn't it?" "We've come for information, not supper," Craddock said. "You spoke to Mrs. Price yesterday." Pritchard's eyes flickered, just briefly. "Aye. She came for the vicar's order. Nothing unusual." Miss Marple's voice drifted softly into the room. "You were seen speaking rather earnestly, Mr. Pritchard." Some said she looked troubled. The butcher shifted on his feet. "She did seem anxious. Asked if I'd seen a man hanging about the lane after dusk, tall fellow in a dark coat. Said she'd thought someone was following her home. I told her nonsense, only young lads up to tricks." Craddock leaned forward. "Did she name him?" "No, but she wasn't her usual brisk self. Wouldn't even take a toffee when I offered one." His attempt at levity fell flat. Then she mentioned leaving service soon, said Christmas might be her last there. Miss Marple's needles clicked once. "Leaving service," she repeated, as though tasting the phrase. "I suppose she'd been saving then?" "Likely," said Pritchard. "She was careful with her wages. Banked them regular, so I've heard." "Did she say why she meant to leave?" "Didn't say. Only muttered something about being tired of seeing what wasn't hers." Odd way to put it, I thought. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. "Yes," she murmured. "Very odd indeed." Outside, the snow had thickened, the flakes whirling in the lamplight like ash. As they walked back toward the vicarage, Craddock grunted. So she feared someone, or perhaps she feared being found out. "Fear," said Miss Marple quietly. "Often makes people hide things in the strangest places, even in plum pudding." He gave her a look of surprise. "You really think she put the knife there herself?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps someone wished us to think so." The pudding was brought to the table with great care. Yet the holly sprig was crooked, a small thing, but curious. One does not risk scalding one's fingers over a wobbling ornament unless there's something else one hopes no one will notice. Craddock frowned. "The knife was meant to be found?" "I shouldn't think so," said Miss Marple, smiling faintly. "Murderers rarely wish for discovery. But accidents happen, especially when too many secrets share a single table." They paused at the gate of the vicarage. Lantern light spilled from the kitchen window. Inside, a constable was examining the cupboards. "You may find," Miss Marple added, "that Mrs. Price wasn't the only person planning to leave this house before Christmas." The remark lingered in Craddock's mind long after they returned indoors. He questioned Mrs. Weatherby again, who insisted she'd heard nothing unusual from the maid that morning. Yet when Miss Marple asked gently whether Mrs. Price had received letters lately, the vicar's wife hesitated. "There was one a week ago. Postmarked London." She wouldn't say from whom, only that it was private. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Private letters have a way of being costly, my dear, especially to those with tender hearts." Later that night, when the inspector took his leave, Miss Marple lingered by the window. Snow covered the lane, softening the world into stillness. A lone set of boot prints led toward the churchyard, fresh, deep, and larger than the housemaid's. She followed them with her eyes until they vanished among the tombstones. Then, very quietly, she said, "If she was frightened of being followed, perhaps she was right." And far off, a single bell tolled from Mary's tower, one measured note that seemed to carry through the cold air like a warning. The following morning dawned pale and silent, the kind of morning that made every sound seem too loud. The vicarage garden lay untouched beneath its snowy cover, save for the narrow trail of footprints leading toward the shed, which the constable had cordoned off with a length of twine. Inside the house, the air carried that strained politeness which follows an unwelcome event. Miss Marple sat quietly by the kitchen hearth, her knitting idle on her lap, while Mrs. Weatherby tried to distract herself by arranging flowers that wilted too quickly in the winter air. Inspector Craddock arrived shortly after 8, stamping the snow from his boots and holding a damp envelope in his hand. "Post came early," he said, handing it to the vicar's wife. "This was addressed to Mrs. Price. A postman left it by mistake in your letterbox." The handwriting was neat but hurried, the kind of script one writes under pressure. Mrs. Weatherby hesitated before passing it to him. "You'd best open it, Inspector. It feels wrong somehow, keeping it closed when she's missing." Craddock slit it open carefully. Inside was a single sheet of cheap paper, folded once. The message, written in pencil, was brief. "If you've not done it yet, don't. They're watching. Burn this at once." The room grew very still. Mrs. Weatherby pressed her hands to her mouth, horrified. Who could have sent that? What could it mean? Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her soft blue eyes on the note. "It's curious," she said gently. "No address, no signature, and written in pencil, not ink. One writes in pencil when one expects the message to vanish, easily burned, easily forgotten. Someone wished to prevent her from doing something. The question is, what had she intended to do?" Craddock folded the note and tucked it into his pocket. "We'll see if we can trace the paper. There's a mark here, Middlesex Stationers, printed faintly along the edge." "London," Miss Marple murmured. "And Mrs. Price's letter last week was postmarked London, too." "Yes," said Craddock, "which suggests she had a correspondent there." Miss Marple's expression was mild, but her mind moved swiftly. London is a long way for a village housemaid to have friends, unless the friendship began before she came here. The vicar's wife recalled, haltingly, that Mrs. Price had once been in service at a townhouse in Bayswater, though she never spoke much of it. She left rather suddenly, I believe, she said, but I assumed she'd merely grown tired of the city. Miss Marple nodded. People seldom leave suddenly unless something compels them to. One does not uproot oneself from habit without cause. Fear, shame, or love, the usual, a trio. Craddock sighed. You think she might have been hiding from someone? Or from something she did, Miss Marple said quietly. But the tone of the note suggests she was being warned, not threatened. Someone cared enough to caution her. They were interrupted by the arrival of the young curate, Mr. Greaves, pale and anxious, holding a small parcel. This was left in the church porch, he said. No name, just tied up in brown paper. The verger thought it best to bring it here. Craddock unwrapped it swiftly. Inside was a white apron, neatly folded, and beneath it a silver cross on a broken chain. Mrs. Weatherby gasped. That's hers, Mrs. Price's cross. She wore it every day. Her mother gave it to her when she went into service. Craddock looked at Miss Marple. So she's alive, and leaving signs behind her. Or someone wants us to think so. Miss Marple touched the chain delicately. The break was clean, almost too neat. It wasn't torn off, in struggle, she said softly. It was cut, and left where it would be found in the church porch, a place of refuge. Whoever left it wanted discovery but not pursuit. Craddock frowned. You think she's hiding nearby? Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the frosted window where the church spire gleamed faintly through the mist. I think, she said after a moment, that the good Lord's house often shelters more confessions than prayers. And perhaps, Inspector, the next time we step inside, we should look not for what's missing, but for what's been replaced. The clock on the mantel chimed 9, and somewhere outside, a dog barked sharp, insistent, near the churchyard. Miss Marple rose slowly, her shawl drawn closer about her shoulders. Do forgive me, Mrs. Weatherby, she said softly, but I think I'll take a little walk. There's something in that snow that wishes to speak before it melts. The cold bit deeper as Miss Marple stepped into the lane, her boots crunching through the thick snow. The morning light was pale and ghostly, filtering through the bare branches of the elms. The church stood ahead, solemn and still, its steeple rising into a grey sky. The dog that had barked moments before was now circling near the church gate, a scruffy terrier belonging to old Mr. Kent, the sexton. When Miss Marple drew closer, the animal darted toward the lich gate, barking again, sharp and urgent. Easy, Benny, she murmured, stooping a little. The dog's paw scratched at the snow where the path met the shadow of the wall. Miss Marple brushed aside the loose flakes with her gloved hand, and there, half buried beneath the thin crust of ice, lay a small brown glove. It was a woman's cheap wool with a single missing button at the wrist. She lifted it carefully, noting the faint dark stain along the palm. Not blood, no. The color was too dull. Treacle, perhaps, or brandy, she thought. Recalling the mixture, brushed over, the pudding's holly sprig. Curious, she murmured. Very curious indeed. At that moment the church door creaked open and Mr. Kent appeared, startled to find her there. Miss Marple, Lord bless me, you near gave me a fright. I've just been into vestry, airing the linens. Whole place smells of wax and damp. Miss Marple smiled faintly. A most dutiful task, Mr. Kent. Tell me, did you happen to find anything unusual this morning? A parcel, perhaps. The old sexton rubbed his nose. Funny you should ask. There was a little basket left by the porch last night. Thought it was for the charity box. But when I looked, there was naught inside but crumbs and a bit of paper. I tossed it on the heap by the shed. A wicker basket? She asked quietly. That's right. Small one, handle tied up with ribbon. Seemed out of place, that did. But we've had stranger offerings, remember, last Lent, when someone left a goose egg painted like the Virgin Mary. Miss Marple's mind was already elsewhere. The missing bicycle, The clean break in the silver chain, the glove beneath the lich gate, and now a discarded basket all spoke of haste, of someone attempting to scatter traces, perhaps to confuse pursuit, or to lead it somewhere specific. "Would you be so kind as to show me that heap by the shed?" she asked. Mr. Kent led her behind the churchyard wall, where a small pile of refuse smouldered faintly in the cold air. There, half charred, lay the remains of a basket, the ribbon still visible, burned at one end. But near it, untouched by flame, was a scrap of paper. Miss Marple bent and lifted it with her gloved fingers. Faded pencil marks ran across it in the same hurried hand as the note found that morning. "South Gate, after service. Come alone." She folded it and slipped it into her pocket, just as the inspector's voice called her name from beyond the gate. Craddock came striding through the snow, his coat collar turned up, his breath misting before him. "I might have known I'd find you here," he said, half exasperated, half admiring. "The vicar's wife said you'd gone walking. I've just had a wire from London. That letter, Mrs. Price received last week came from an address in Bayswater Lodgings under the name of H. Elms." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Elms?" she repeated. "How suitable for someone with roots in deceit. And what does Mr. Elms say for himself?" Craddock shook his head. "The address was vacant when our men called. Left 2 days ago. In a hurry. Paid in cash." Landlady described him as tall, dark coat, clean-shaven, said he'd been expecting someone from the country. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So Mrs. Price meant to meet him. Perhaps at the South Gate after service, just as this note says. But if he arrived early, and she was frightened." Her eyes drifted toward the half-burned basket. "Then perhaps she never got as far as the gate." Craddock frowned, studying her. "You think he came here?" "I think," she said softly, "that he came to retrieve something, and that poor Mrs. Price, having hidden it, found herself unable or unwilling to hand it over." The wind stirred the bare branches above them, scattering snow like ashes. Miss Marple turned back toward the church door, her expression distant. "Whatever she concealed, Inspector, it lies close to faith. People hide their sins where they think God might forgive them quickest." And with that quiet remark, she stepped inside the dim nave, the air thick with candle wax and silence, her footsteps echoing softly across the stone floor toward the vestry where, perhaps, the truth waited in shadow. The air inside the church was heavy with the chill of stone and the faint sweetness of candle wax. Miss Marple paused by the font, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. The nave stood empty, though the smell of extinguished candles suggested recent use. Craddock followed a few steps behind, his boots echoing on the flagstones. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked softly, and the faint rustle of fabric carried through the stillness. Miss Marple turned toward the vestry. "The sexton said he had been airing the linens," she whispered. "But someone else has been here since then." Craddock nodded, resting his hand lightly on the door latch. "Stay back, Miss Marple," he murmured, and pushed the door open. Inside, the vestry was dimly lit by a single oil lamp left burning on the table. The cupboards along the wall stood ajar, their contents neat but disturbed, cassocks slightly displaced, drawers half closed, as if someone had searched hastily. A small puddle of melted snow gleamed on the floor. Craddock's voice dropped. "Someone's been here within the last hour." Miss Marple approached the table and examined the lamp. "Freshly filled," she said softly. "And the wick trimmed. That's not the sexton's doing. He's too frugal to waste oil in daylight." Her gaze fell upon a folded piece of cloth beside the lamp, a linen altar covering, its corner faintly creased. When she lifted it, something metallic clinked to the floor. It was a key, small and ornate, with a tag tied to it in rough twine. Written in pencil, nearly smudged away, were 2 words. "Green Cottage." Craddock frowned. "That's half a mile beyond the church, deserted since the Rileys moved to London last spring." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. and I recall Mrs. Price walking that way often in the evenings. She said she liked the view from the meadow, but I dare say there was more comfort in solitude than scenery. She turned the key thoughtfully in her fingers. If she was to meet someone there, it would explain much: the secrecy, the fear, even this. She gestured toward the melted snow. A man could come by the back lane unnoticed. Craddock was already striding toward the door. "We'll go there now." But Miss Marple lingered, her gaze resting on the empty prayer bench. "In a moment," she said softly. "It's wise to see what people leave behind in haste." Kneeling, she touched the wood. Where someone had pressed their hand, faint traces of moisture remained. Underneath the bench, tucked neatly against the wall, was a crumpled scrap of cloth, stiff and dark. She drew it out slowly. It was a man's handkerchief, monogrammed H.E. Faint but legible. "Our friend Mr. Elms, I presume," she murmured. Craddock's eyes narrowed. "So he was here." "And left in a hurry," Miss Marple said, rising. The puddle of snow, the displaced drawers. He was looking for something he couldn't find. Something she hid. They stepped back into the cold afternoon. Snow still fell, thin as sifted flour. The road to Green Cottage wound past the churchyard and into the trees. The world hushed but for the crunch of their boots. A crow cawed somewhere overhead, its cry sharp in the stillness. As they neared the cottage, Craddock motioned for caution. The little house stood dark beneath its thatched roof, the windows frosted over. He tested the door locked. Miss Marple held up the key, and with a faint click, it opened. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and something faintly sweet, perhaps brandy or polish. A single chair had been pulled to the center of the room, beside a cold hearth. On the table lay a woman's scarf, and beneath it, a folded letter sealed with wax. Craddock tore it open carefully. The letter was brief, in the same hand as before. "I cannot keep it here any longer. They will come for it soon. If you do not meet me, it will be the end of us both." Miss Marple's voice was low, not a lover's note. A warning again. "And look." She pointed to the ashes in the hearth. Among them lay fragments of burned paper and a small, twisted piece of metal, the corner of a broken locket. "She tried to destroy whatever she was hiding," Miss Marple said. And someone stopped her. Craddock straightened, his face grim. "If she came here last night, she may never have left." Miss Marple looked toward the window, where a faint trail of footprints, half filled with snow, led into the trees. Her expression softened, almost sorrowful. "No," she said quietly. "She left, but not of her own accord." The wind rattled the shutters, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then Miss Marple drew the curtains aside, gazing into the darkening wood. "Inspector," she said softly, "I believe the truth is buried out there, not deep, but cleverly. And before night falls, we must let the snow tell its story." The snow in the woods lay heavy and undisturbed, save for a faint depression that wound away from the cottage toward the old boundary hedge. Craddock moved ahead with his torch, its narrow beam cutting through the dimming light, while Miss Marple followed more slowly, her eyes tracing the ground with deliberate care. The prints were faint but distinct: a man's boots, large, uneven, as if the wearer had been carrying a weight. Every few paces there was a scuff, a drag, the sign of something being pulled through the snow. "Not a sack," Miss Marple murmured to herself. "Too narrow a trail, more like a body dragged by the arms." Craddock stopped and turned sharply. "Good Lord, Miss Marple." She raised a calm hand. "I have no proof, Inspector, only the evidence nature provides. But if I'm not mistaken, we shall find the place soon enough." They pressed on, the air thick with cold and silence. The trees loomed darker now, their branches bending under frost. Ahead, a small clearing opened, the kind used by woodcutters years ago. The snow here was disturbed, churned into uneven patches. Craddock bent low, brushing aside the surface. Beneath, the earth showed through, recently disturbed and frozen over. He looked up grimly. "We'll have to dig. Fetch the men from the gate." But Miss Marple crouched beside him, her gloved fingers lightly tracing the edge of the disturbed ground. "No need, Inspector. Look here." She pointed to a faint gleam caught beneath the frost, a thin chain tangled around a twig, the broken end dangling. "It matches the silver cross she wore." Craddock's jaw tightened. "Then she's here." Miss Marple's expression was grave but composed. "It would seem so. Poor girl. She was frightened enough to seek sanctuary, yet still found no safety. But I wonder." Her eyes swept the area again. "Why bury her here, within sight of the cottage? It's too near. A man clever enough to send false notes and burn letters would not risk discovery so close to his own meeting place." Craddock frowned. "You think it's a decoy?" "I think," said Miss Marple quietly, "that someone wished us to believe she is here. That patch of earth has frozen smooth again. It's been disturbed, yes, but earlier, before the last snowfall. Whoever did this wanted to hide something else." She brushed away a little more snow and revealed the edge of a small tin box, half buried in the soil. Craddock pried it loose. Inside, wrapped in a strip of linen, was a packet of papers, browned at the edges. He opened them carefully. The first page bore a letterhead: "Henderson and Blythe, Solicitors, Bayswater." "What in blazes?" he muttered. "These are legal documents, wills, deeds, even a bank receipt." Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet recognition. Ah, so that was it. Mrs. Price wasn't merely hiding from a man. She was hiding what he wanted, and quite possibly what he'd stolen. She must have discovered it while in service, years ago, and carried the burden ever since. Craddock scanned the papers. A property settlement in the name of Henry Elms. But the signatures don't match forged, perhaps? "Undoubtedly," Miss Marple said. "And forgery leaves a long shadow, Inspector. Mrs. Price likely threatened to expose him. The note warning her not to do it makes sense now. Someone, perhaps a friend in London, urged her to stay silent. But she meant to reveal the truth, likely to the vicar or the constable. That would explain why she hid the documents here, in a place she thought safe." Craddock exhaled, the breath clouding in the frozen air. If she hid these, then Elms came for them last night. He must have seen her leave the vicarage. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the dark outline of the church steeple, barely visible through the trees. "Yes," she said softly, and when she refused him, he silenced her. "But I don't think he killed her here. No. He'd have used the lane easy to pass off footprints, easy to vanish before dawn." Craddock looked at her sharply. "Then where is she?" Miss Marple's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Where she thought she'd be safest, where he could reach her without suspicion. Inspector, I believe we must return to the vicarage. There's one room there. No one has searched the pantry." Craddock stared, startled. "The pantry?" "But because," she interrupted softly, "that was the last place anyone saw her alive. And if I am right, the pudding wasn't the only thing hiding something that day." The woods fell utterly silent as they turned back toward the village, the snow swallowing their footsteps, leaving behind only a faint trail like a secret unwilling to stay buried. The lamps in the vicarage burned low when they returned, their glow pooling in the hallway and throwing long shadows along the panelled walls. Mrs. Weatherby had gone to bed, sedated by the doctor, and the curate sat by the fire, pale and trembling. The house, though warm, held an air of strain, as though it waited for something dreadful to be spoken aloud. Miss Marple entered first, her step light but purposeful, and went straight toward the kitchen, her shawl trailing faintly over the carpet. Craddock followed, weary and grim, the tin box of papers clutched beneath his arm. The kitchen felt strangely untouched, as if time itself had paused since the day of the luncheon. The same faint scent of brandy and spices hung in the air. The pudding dish, now cold and empty, still rested on the counter where it had been set aside. Miss Marple looked around slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar domestic clutter, the pots by the stove, the folded cloths on the dresser, the half-open door of the pantry standing just beyond the scullery arch. The last place she was seen, Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Price brought in the pudding, went to fetch custard from the pantry, and vanished. The sequence is neat, too neat. The human world rarely runs so tidily, unless someone wishes it to. Craddock set the tin box down. You think he followed her in here? I think, she said quietly, that he was already inside. He frowned. Inside the house? Yes. You see, everyone's attention was fixed upon the dining table. The moment the pudding arrived, all eyes were on that doorway. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for a man to slip through the back, especially if he knew the layout. Mrs. Price must have caught sight of him when she went for the custard. She'd have realized he'd come for the papers. Craddock's jaw tightened. Then she tried to hide them. Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. But where? She stepped into the narrow pantry, its air colder than the kitchen's, tinged with the faint, sweet smell of preserves and soap. The shelves were orderly flour tins, stacked in rows, jars of jam gleaming ruby in the lamplight. She examined each shelf methodically, her delicate fingers brushing the edges, tapping lightly as she went. When she reached the far wall, she paused. There's a draft. Here, she said softly. Feel it, Inspector? Craddock stepped closer, testing the wall with his hand. A loose board, perhaps. He reached for his pocket knife and eased it beneath the lowest shelf. The wood gave a faint creak and lifted slightly, revealing a narrow gap behind it. Miss Marple knelt, her expression intent, and drew out a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. Inside was a single sheet of folded paper, badly creased. And beneath it, a small wooden rosary with one bead cracked clean through. The paper bore a few hurried words in faint pencil. If anything happens, it was not the vicar. Craddock read it twice, his brow furrowed. Good Lord. She was trying to protect him. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, because she knew how it would look. He was the only man with access to every key, every corridor, every quiet hour. If she vanished, suspicion might fall naturally upon him. And she, poor soul, was thinking of decency and reputation even as she faced her end. Craddock turned toward her sharply. Then she did die here. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room once more. No, Inspector, not here. There would be some trace disturbance, struggle. Something to mark her fear. This room is too peaceful, too untouched. She hid the papers, wrote her note, and left again, perhaps coerced, perhaps believing she could reason with him. But she never went willingly far from this place. Look closely. The snow outside the kitchen door, the second set of footprints, remember? They stopped before the gate. She never reached it because he met her right there, in the shadow of the porch. Craddock's voice dropped. Then where is she now? Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the small door near the larder, one that opened into the cellar. It stood slightly ajar, as if left carelessly after use. Sometimes, she said, almost to herself, the simplest hiding places are the least suspected. She took up the lantern and began to descend, her step cautious on the worn stone stairs. The cellar smelled of coal dust and cold earth. Craddock followed, his torch cutting a narrow circle of light ahead of them. The walls were lined with barrels and crates, all covered in a fine layer of dust except one, a large wooden chest near the far corner. Its surface bore a smudge, a faint handprint recently made. Craddock approached and knelt beside it. Locked, he said curtly. Miss Marple passed him the key from the vestry, the one labeled Green Cottage. Try this, she murmured. It fit perfectly. The lock turned with a soft click. Craddock hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a coarse blanket, lay the motionless form of Mrs. Price. Her face was pale, serene, her hair still neatly pinned. Around her wrist gleamed a dark bruise. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Poor child," she whispered. She never had a chance to speak her truth. Craddock bowed his head. "He killed her here, then carried her to the cottage later. The false trail, the basket, the glove, it was all staged." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and it was clever, too clever. He wanted to draw us away from this house, from what truly bound her fate. Those documents, the note, and her loyalty to a good man. She hid the proof in the one place he wouldn't risk searching again, and left just enough behind to clear the innocent." For a long moment they stood in silence, the lantern light flickering over the stone walls. Then Craddock spoke, his tone low. "We'll find him, Miss Marple. I swear it." "Oh, I have no doubt you will," she said gently. "But it won't be by force of law, Inspector. It will be by the flaw in his conscience. Murderers rarely fear discovery. They fear recognition. Someone in this village has already seen his face, though they may not yet realize what they know." As they climbed back toward the kitchen, Miss Marple paused at the top of the stairs. Her voice, when she spoke again, was soft but certain. "He'll come back here. They always do, in the end, to make sure the secret still sleeps." And outside, beyond the frosted window, the wind rose through the trees, carrying the faint, far-off echo of footsteps on snow, as if someone were already returning to the vicarage in the dark. The clock in the hall had just struck 11 when the footsteps came again, soft, deliberate, and muffled by the snow outside. The wind pressed faintly against the panes, and the vicarage seemed to draw a slow, uneasy breath. Miss Marple stood by the kitchen table, her shawl drawn close, while Inspector Craddock signaled to the constable near the door to stay silent. The lantern had been turned low, the cellar door left half open. Everything was ready, though the air itself seemed to tremble with waiting. A faint creak came from the scullery. The latch moved, the outer door eased open an inch, then another, and a gust of cold air swept in, carrying with it a single flake of snow. A dark figure stepped across the threshold, careful, watchful, moving like a man who knew the room by heart. He closed the door quietly behind him and stood still, listening. Then, with slow precision, he took 2 steps toward the pantry. Craddock's voice rang out sharply. "That'll do." The man froze. The lantern flared as the inspector raised it, throwing light across the intruder's face. He was tall, clean-shaven, his features sharp and composed, even under sudden exposure. A faint smile curved his lips, though his eyes held no warmth. "Good evening, Inspector," he said smoothly. "You have the advantage, it seems. Though I must say, this is hardly the welcome one expects when paying a call." "Henry Elms," Craddock said grimly, "or whatever name you're using now. You've got a great deal to answer for." Elms's gaze drifted past him toward Miss Marple, standing by the hearth. "Ah, the lady from the luncheon. I should have known. The quiet ones always listen best." Miss Marple's tone was mild, almost polite. "You came back to see if your little arrangement was still undiscovered, I expect. Murderers have a curious sense of neatness. I've always found they can't bear a loose thread." His expression hardened. "You use very strong words, madam." "Not stronger than your actions," she said softly. "You killed Mrs. Price." He laughed once, low and without humor. "Killed her? Nonsense. The woman was desperate, unstable. She followed me, begged me to take her away. When she realized I wouldn't, she threatened to ruin us both. I tried to reason with her. She ran into the night. I never saw her again." Miss Marple's eyes were steady. "You saw her again in the pantry. She had the papers, you forged documents linking your name to money that was never yours. You needed them destroyed, and she refused. You struck her, perhaps not intending to kill. But kill her you did. The bruise on her wrist speaks plainly enough." Elms's composure faltered for a heartbeat. "You've no proof," he said quickly. "On the contrary," said Craddock, stepping closer. We found her note, her hiding place, and the tin of stolen documents she concealed from you. We know she meant to expose you. And you made the mistake of coming back to fetch what you'd missed. Elms's eyes flickered toward the back door, measuring the distance. Craddock saw it and moved to block the way. Don't be foolish, Elms. The lane's full of my men. Miss Marple spoke again, her tone gentle but piercing. There's no point, Mr. Elms. I dare say you never meant to take a life. But once one falsehood is born, it breeds another, and soon a good man or woman must pay the price for keeping another's secret. Mrs. Price was afraid. Yes, but not of exposure. She feared you, and that fear drove her straight to her death. He turned on her then, anger flaring through his polished civility. You meddling old woman! Craddock seized his arm before he could move further. That's enough, he snapped. You'll have your say at the station. But Elms twisted suddenly, a desperate motion fueled by cornered rage. The lamp toppled, the light flaring wildly across the walls. For a moment, confusion filled the room, the clang of metal, the crash of the overturned chair, Miss Marple's voice calling for calm. Then Craddock struck him once, cleanly, and the man went down hard onto the tiles. When the commotion subsided, the constable secured the prisoner. Elms lay still, breathing heavily, his elegant manner shattered, replaced by something hollow and frightened. Miss Marple watched in silence, her knitting hands folded before her. When Craddock turned to her, she said quietly, "It was inevitable, I'm afraid." He had too tidy a mind for deceit. Men like that can't rest until they've made certain their sins are properly arranged. Craddock rubbed his forehead. You've seen too many of these, haven't you, ma'am? Her eyes softened. Too many, yes. And yet each one is quite the same, born not of malice, but of vanity. Mr. Elms thought himself clever enough to outwit both justice and conscience, but the smallest detail betrayed him. Craddock frowned. What detail? The pudding, she said simply. The knife he placed within it to throw suspicion upon Mrs. Price's disappearance. It was foolishly sentimental, perhaps an attempt to make her seem vengeful, deranged. But he forgot that no servant would handle a kitchen blade without wiping it clean first. The smear of resin from the holly mixture was his own doing. Only someone unfamiliar with housework would have made such a mistake. The inspector gave a slow nod of admiration. You never miss a thing, do you, Miss Marple? She smiled faintly. Oh, one misses plenty, Inspector. One merely tries not to overlook what matters most. The house grew, still again as Elms was led away. Outside, the snow continued to fall in soft, soundless sheets. The vicar appeared at the staircase, pale and bewildered, and Miss Marple spoke gently to him, reassuring him that the burden of scandal had passed. He thanked her, voice trembling, and retreated upstairs to pray for the soul of his lost servant. Later, as Craddock prepared to leave, Miss Marple stood at the window, looking out toward the churchyard where the faint lamplight glimmered on untouched snow. There's always a tragedy in small places, she said softly. We think our village is safe because the sins are familiar, but that only makes them easier to hide. Craddock nodded. And you, Miss Marple, how do you sleep after it all? She gave him a kindly smile. Quite peacefully, my dear Inspector. I remind myself that goodness, like guilt, always leaves a trace. You only have to look for it. He said nothing more, only tipped his hat and stepped out into the night. The door closed gently behind him. Miss Marple remained by the window a moment longer, watching the snow fall over Mary Mead, until the footsteps faded down the lane, and silence returned deep, white, and unbroken once more. Morning crept over Mary Mead in a soft silver haze, the snow now crusted with frost that glimmered faintly in the first light. A hush had settled over the village, that peculiar quiet which follows a night of revelation. Word had spread, as it always did, faster than any constable could manage. By dawn, Every housewife and shopkeeper knew that Henry Elms, once a polite stranger lodging at the Green Man, had been taken away in handcuffs. Yet though the culprit was caught, the village itself seemed subdued, uneasy, as though goodness required time to thaw after being so near to evil. At the vicarage, Miss Marple sat in the morning room with her teacup cooling beside her. The fire crackled, the light slanted across the lace curtains, and the faint scent of lavender, polish clung to the air. She looked very small in the armchair. Grey wool against grey light. Yet there was a watchfulness in her eyes, a reflective calm that only came once the pieces of a puzzle had finally fallen into their proper places. Inspector Craddock entered quietly, looking more relaxed than he had in days. "He's confessed," he said simply. "After a few hours at the station, he told us everything. The forgeries, the blackmail, the argument with Mrs. Price. Claimed it was an accident, said she struck her head when she tried to leave. But he admitted to hiding her in the cellar afterward and to staging that little pantomime with the glove and the basket." Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving gently in her lap. "It was bound to come. A man like that always believes he can arrange the world into order again, even after he's ruined it. It's the arrogance that betrays them." Craddock took a seat opposite her, his weariness showing through the satisfaction of closure. He said she found the documents by accident while cleaning his room at the Bayswater house. Years ago. She must have recognized the names, people she'd worked for, and realized something was amiss. When he came here to hide after the fraud broke, she followed him, threatening to expose him if he didn't make amends. He thought he could silence her quietly. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window. "She was a good woman," she said softly, "proud, but not cruel. I think she would have spared him if he'd shown even a shred of remorse, but he mistook compassion for weakness. Many men do." Craddock sighed. "You saw it all before I did. I'll never know how you do it." She smiled faintly. "One observes, Inspector, and one remembers. Murder, you see, is rarely about hatred. It's about fear. Fear of discovery, fear of loss, fear of being made small in the eyes of others. I've seen it before in a kitchen maid who stole from her mistress and in a colonel who cheated at cards. Human nature doesn't change, only the stage upon which it performs." Craddock leaned back, half amused, half admiring. "And what convinced you, beyond all doubt, that he was the killer?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Several small things, really. The knife in the pudding. For one, it was far too deliberate. No servant would desecrate a Christmas dish that way. And then the ribbon from the apron, cut rather than torn. He used it to bind the parcel of papers she'd hidden. Only a man unused to housework would think to cut cloth instead of untying it. And, of course, the monogrammed handkerchief in the vestrymen who commit such sins are often careless about the tokens of their own vanity." He chuckled softly. "You make it sound like a sermon." "Oh, not at all," she said mildly. "Just an observation on life. People show who they are in the smallest habits, how they hold a teacup, how they fold a letter, how they lie. Poor Mrs. Price never understood that her decency alone made her a danger to such a man. She believed, quite sincerely, that the truth would right itself." Craddock was silent a moment, then said, "We'll give her a proper burial. The vicar insists on it. Half the village is already planning to bring flowers." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is as it should be. We must honor those who suffer for honesty. The world grows rather cold when we forget them." He looked around the cozy room, at the orderly shelves, the vase of dried heather, the faint ticking of the clock. "You know, I always wonder what drives you, Miss Marple. You've no official post, no obligation, and yet you're always there, quietly finding truth where the rest of us stumble." Her eyes softened, though her smile held a touch of sadness. "Oh, I've lived a long while, Inspector. Long enough to know that kindness without understanding is helpless, and understanding without kindness is cruel. When one has seen both, one feels rather bound to interfere now and then." Outside, a church bell chimed the hour. The sound rolled across the snowbound roofs, pure and clear, like a benediction. For a moment, neither spoke. The peace of the morning settled around them, broken only by the faint clink of the teacup as Miss Marple set it down. Craddock rose at last. "You'll be pleased to know the village is already writing legends about you," he said dryly. "According to Mrs. Bantry, you solved the whole case by gazing into your knitting basket." Miss Marple laughed, a sound as gentle as the falling snow. "Dear Dolly, she always did have a flair for embroidery of the verbal kind, I mean. But perhaps it's for the best. A good story comforts people more than the truth. The truth, you see, tends to stay with one too long." Craddock nodded slowly. "Well, you've my thanks again. I'll see to the rest of it." When he was gone, Miss Marple sat for a while in silence, her thoughts wandering back over the past days, the pudding, the frightened eyes of Mrs. Price, the moment in the cellar when the truth had come cold and clear as frost. She thought of Elms, now sitting in a narrow cell, still certain that fate had cheated him rather than his own conscience. And she thought, too, of the vicar and his gentle wife, who would spend Christmas in quiet sorrow rather than celebration. The fire crackled softly. On the mantelpiece, a sprig of holly gleamed in the lamplight, its berries red against the grey morning. Miss Marple reached for her knitting again, the rhythmic motion of the needle soothing, deliberate. Outside, children's voices carried faintly down the lane, singing the first carol of the season, pure, unbroken notes drifting through the snow. She smiled, almost wistfully. Life, as she often said, had a way of continuing, no matter what secrets it had uncovered. And though Mary Mead would gossip, speculate, and forget, she would remember the truth, not for its cruelty, but for its lesson. As the last verse of the carol faded, she murmured softly to herself, "People are very much the same everywhere. One only needs to listen." Then she poured fresh tea, added a lump of sugar, and went on knitting, calm, content, and quietly watchful as ever, while the peaceful little village settled once more beneath its winter snow.